Ready?
Yep.
Well, tonight we are privileged to have Diane Hall as our main speaker. She is our delegate to the Great Lakes Association of Astronomy Clubs that, for example, is heavily involved in astronomy at the beach. She has previously been the outreach chairman excuse me, for this club and our first vice president in charge of the program. And we're bringing her back in January to again be our outreach chairman because she does a really good job of that. She is a self-described shuttle hugger, really an expert in the whole space shuttle program where we sent astronauts to the moon. And incidentally, if you had not heard, our main speaker this Thursday night at our annual banquet was at Mission Control during the Apollo missions. And tonight is your last night to get a reduced rate if you want to go to that. She also enjoys binocular astronomy and claims she's been observing since the age of 4 when a grandfather taught her how to find Cassiopeia. She also co-hosts the weekly show Space Pirate Radio on astronomy.fm.
With Marty?
With Marty. So, we just heard a presentation on searching for Omega Centauri. Tonight, Diane is going to talk about searching for Vulcan. The story we'll let her tell.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you very much. All right, so we're going to talk about the 9th planet in the solar system tonight, or rather the X9th planet. And it seems it's not very good to be the 9th planet in the solar system because you tend to get dethroned. So planet Vulcan, the planet of romance, as one of its true believers called it. So we start off with a different planet, Mercury, closest to the sun, the trickster planet. Its path around the sun is brief. Its appearances at dusk or dawn are fleeting. And it's said that Nicholas Copernicus never observed it in all of his years working on how the heavens functioned. He included none of his own observations in his work. So as far as we know, he never saw it. However, he certainly found it an area of concern. He said, "This planet has inflicted many perplexities and labors upon us in our investigation of its wanderings." And of course, all planets wander, that's where the name comes from, but Mercury wanders a little bit more and a little bit more strangely than the rest. Well, the advent of the telescopic era didn't unravel what was going on with Mercury. So you had the greatest astronomical minds of the age working out where everything was, with more and more elaborate celestial atlases, ever more precise planetary tables. Successive generations of astronomers were not afraid to correct the works of their elders, so you had great aha moments like when young Jeremiah Horrocks of England, there in the center, corrected Kepler and realized that a transit of Venus was just around the corner. Another thing that Horrocks worked on in his very brief career was there was a wobble in the orbit of the moon, which is really a story of its own. But it was frustrating. And Horrocks came up with an idea that kind of sort of explained it, but not really. And then a generation later, Sir Isaac Newton applied himself to this little lunar mystery and was absolutely and completely stymied. So the guy who gave us the laws of planetary motion, the idea of universal gravitation, he could not figure out what was going on with the moon. He claimed to his dying day that it was one of his biggest frustrations. But as troubling as the moon was, Mercury was still even more annoying. And it's particularly obvious that something was going on for Mercury when it came to the transits across the sun. So you see that little black there in the center of Mr. Sun is not a sunspot, it is the planet Mercury and one of its many transits. They come about 13 times a century, so plenty of opportunity to observe them, even if you're in the 17th, 18th century and you can't travel very far. And the earliest transit observed was in 1631 when Pierre Gassendi got to see it. Well, while the much rarer transits of Venus became a scientific tool for calculating the distance between the Sun and the Earth, Mercury's transits led to a totally different kind of scientific quest. It didn't matter whose planetary tables astronomers used. Edmund Halley, J.J. Lalande, again, all the great minds of their generation. They were always wrong. Mercury either showed up too early or too late. There was one transit in 1786. All the astronomers in Paris except for one gave up because they were using Lalande's modern, sophisticated tables. He was off by 3/4 of an hour. Edmund Halley was off by 3/4 of an hour in the other direction. And Mercury arrived halfway in between their calculations. So, it took a while for Newton's ideas in celestial mechanics to catch on, especially in France, which favored Descartes' ideas of vortices whirling through space for about 50 years after Newton published Principia. But once France caught on to Newton's ideas, they loved it, they embraced it fully, and all the great French mathematicians began working with Newtonian theory. One who was initially a skeptic, the guy in the wig, Clairaut, Alexis Claude Clairaut, he was a skeptic of Newtonian mechanics, but when he finally solved the puzzle of the lunar model, he realized that it only strengthened Newtonian theory, and he became a believer, and it was a very early, convincing piece of, hey, Newton was onto something. Clairaut was a real, he's not that famous here, in the US at least, but he calculated the orbit of what we now call Halley's Comet. He resolved irregularities in the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn that had really just annoyed both Kepler and Horrocks in the previous century. And he solved the lunar thing. So he was absolutely going gangbusters, but apparently it went to his head and he started partying very hard and then died. So that was the end of his career. Dead at 52 of too much wine, women, song, and dinner parties. So a couple of other guys here, Pierre-Simon Laplace and Joseph-Louis Lagrange. Boy, those sound like familiar names. They applied themselves to working out the discrepancies between predicted planetary paths and where the planets actually showed up. And so at the same time that you had, say, Messier hunting his comets and Herschel scanning the skies with his big, beautiful telescope, you had this different branch of astronomy where the guys were crunching numbers to try to make everything work. And it looked really good, and it was one of those eras where we just do a little bit more, we can solve all of these problems. Now, math problems aren't the only problems. A lot of astronomical gremlins are simply things that astronomers believe that they've seen. And even the greatest astronomers screw up. Neath, the phantom moon of Venus, first observed by Cassini the first. Surface details on Venus, Martian canals, you can go on and on and on. Rings around Neptune that are not at all the rings that have been scientifically confirmed, which are just little arcs anyway. People see things, averted imagination, I think we've all done it at least once. And it's also worth keeping in mind that an astronomer with a monomaniacal bent on cataloging every object, or refining the calculation just a little bit more, you might be a little nuts. basically, most great astronomers are a little bit nuts, and that it helps to keep that in mind.
It's easy to do.
Yeah. But in the early 19th century, so we're a couple of centuries past Galileo here, astronomers are chasing something other than illusions in the eyepiece. They were looking at the math, they were looking at patterns, and you had things like this apparent law. It's called Bode's law, but it really wasn't invented by Bode. It was invented by, at least, observed by this other gentleman at Titius. The spacing of the planets follow a pattern. And it looked like there would be another planet somewhere between Jupiter and Mars. Well, when people looked at minor planets, Ceres, Pallas, Juno, Vesta, the four biggest, brightest asteroids, and then when Uranus was discovered, it fit the pattern. There should have been a planet right about there, and there was. It's not really a law in the same sense that you've got a fundamental physical law that matter and actually follows. It's kind of like Kepler's original laws of planetary motion. It's an empirical law. You've got the data, you make up a law based on the data that fits with what you see. It may not be fundamentally true, in this case it wasn't, but it was the kind of framework that astronomers were using to investigate what is going on. And so, this is the scene upon which we find this young man here, the armchair astronomer of the 19th century, the man who discovered a planet with the point of his pen. And it might not be the man that you're thinking of, because there's two names associated with this particular triumph. So, Herschel discovered Uranus the old-fashioned way, looking through his eyepiece, in 1781. By the 1820s, there were already noted discrepancies between where Uranus should have been, according to calculations, and where it actually was. And so, there arose the idea that there was another planet out there, probably somewhere where Bode's law predicted it to be, affecting Uranus with its gravity. And young Urbain J.J. Leverrier, working at the Paris Observatory, calculated an orbit for this hypothetical planet, convinced the astronomers at the Berlin Observatory to go have a look, and they found it on September 23rd of 1846, within 1 degree of where Leverrier said the planet ought to be. The discovery of Neptune, is arguably the finest hour of straight-up Newtonian mechanics. The system worked. The science worked. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary. And of course, now we know that Neptune is indeed a bit of a gravitational bully, second only to Jupiter of the planets. And even so, it's not the reason Uranus was doing the things it was doing, but hey, that's a whole other saga in and of itself. Now, Leverrier was not the only mathematical genius out there. A young Englishman named John Couch, it's spelled Couch, it's pronounced Couch, he was Cornish. He worked it out too. But he was a shy academic guy. His calculations were quite as good as Leverrier, and he wasn't nearly as good about convincing anybody to look for his planet. So, since one is English, the other is French, there's always been a bit of a to-do over who gets the credit. Historically, it's credited to them both. Honestly, it belongs to Leverrier. He actually said to people, hey, find my planet, and they did. You know, he gets credit. Well, Adams and Leverrier didn't take it personally. Adams went off to a quiet little life in academia, which seemed to suit him just fine. Leverrier became a scientific megastar of the mid-19th century. By 1854, he was the director of the Paris Observatory. And this was his palace. Now, I called him an armchair astronomer. Allegedly, he never even bothered to look at a telescope to see his own planet Neptune. Never saw it. Wasn't interested. Now, we've no proof that Adams ever looked at his own planet either, but, you know, That's not what these men were about. Leverrier had no interest in William Herschel's style of astronomy. Under him, the Paris Observatory was a place of computation ruled by a rigid and authoritarian taskmaster. And guess who? He didn't care about morale. He didn't care about allowing his assistants to embrace their specialties or pursue their passion. He docked their wages if they deviated from the tasks that he gave them. He appropriated their discoveries. Basically, he was a jerk. And one of the young assistants that he treated very poorly was a man named Camille Flammarion, who came to the observatory as I can only call him a fanboy. He thought Leverrier was God. Well, then he had to work for him. And he quickly developed into a rival and a very harsh critic. And part of it was not just personality-based. Flammarion had a very keen interest in the nature of other worlds. What's Neptune made of? Who lives there? Are there beings on Neptune? Are there beings on Uranus? What are these worlds? What are they like? And eventually he got into the territory of just total outright mysticism. But this is a scientist with a sense of wonder at the universe. Leverrier had no sense of wonder at the universe. When Flammarion published a little work called The Plurality of Inhabited Worlds in 1862 and became an overnight sensation, he got fired. That's the kind of ship Leverrier ran. But he wasn't just abusing his assistants. He had decided he was going to do something about this Mercury problem. The difficult little cog of the Newtonian clock. He was the man to solve it. He'd actually given it a try back in 1843, before he became famous. And that time he didn't really get to a satisfactory answer. But now, with the whole Paris Observatory and all that staff of young men who could do computations for him, he tried again. So he and the staff sifted through decades of observations, other people's observations, English, French, whatever they could get. And they were able to rule out that all these problems with Mercury came down to the astronomers. It just, mathematically, it wasn't human error. Something was actually going on with the planet. What happens is, Mercury, if Mercury was just revolving around the sun by itself, it would follow the path of a fixed ellipse forever. Instead, its closest approach to the sun advances with each century. It's tracing out a spirograph design in its orbital plane. Unless astronomers knew that offset, every astronomer trying to predict Mercury would always be wrong. Well, Leverrier and his crew managed to work out the factors affecting Mercury and by what percentage when you take the influence of Venus, of Jupiter, of the Earth, Mars, Saturn, and even Uranus. You have 38 arc seconds of movement in each century that you can't account for. So Mercury's advancing every century to the tune of about one full revolution every 3 million years, according to Leverrier's figures. But 38 arc seconds per century just is magical. Well, you can't have that. So what's causing it? Well, what's Leverrier's toolbox? What's affecting the planet? Other planets. Where would this one be? Inside the orbit of Mercury. Like a bookend to Neptune. Leverrier went public with this hypothesis in 1859. This is 13 years after the discovery of Neptune. And at that time, he did not insist that it would be a planet. He was sort of entertaining the idea of a second asteroid belt, one inside Mercury's orbit. And that all of these little objects together added up to this force that was making Mercury offset itself. But then, Christmas of 1859, an unsolicited letter arrives. And Leverrier's stance on Mercury crystallized into a position he was going to defend the rest of his life. In the small town of Orgères lived a doctor, a physician, Edmond Lescarbault, an amateur astronomer who witnessed a transit of Mercury in 1845 and was very much into that. And he built a dome above his surgery where he could see patients and then run up and take some observations and run back down and run up. He was really into the astronomy thing. So according to Lescarbault, on March 26th of 1859, months before Leverrier went public with this intramercurial planet idea, he'd seen a black spot crossing the face of the sun, which looked like a transiting planet. He'd seen one, he knew what that looked like. Now, he had no ingress time. It had already entered the sun when he began his observations, and then he had to run down and deal with some patients, and then he came back upstairs, and oh, it had moved. And as he watched, it exited the disk of the sun. He estimated it had been on the sun's face for about an hour and 17 minutes. Well, Leverrier decided he was going to do some investigation personally. So the great man, and this tale comes to us by the scientist cleric Abbé Moigno, the man who termed Vulcan, as we come to call it, the planet of romance. Leverrier swoops into Orgères, tracks down Lescarbault as practice, does not indicate at any point who he is. He just starts questioning the guy, interrogating him, in a manner that Moigno compared to a lion interacting with a timid little lamb. This might actually be a picture of Lescarbault. I found it through some French sources. It seems to be the only one available. A lot of the sources surrounding this controversy are in French, and I can't read French, so that made for some fun research. Well, Leverrier inspected the observatory. Perfectly good refractor, made by a man of some skill, no fame, but definitely skill. He inspected the doctor's equipment, the little pendulum that he used as a timekeeping device, the same thing that Lescarbault used to take the pulse of his patients. He inspected the records, which were, scratched on wood, basically. The notes, the calculations, had Lescarbault sketch out what he had seen. And when all this was done, Leverrier said, hey, good enough. He goes back to Paris, says, 9th planet found. And he recommends that this country doctor, this timid little lamb, be made a chevalier of the Legion of Honor, which he was. So the word goes out, and by February 10th of 1860, less than 2 months after the letter arrived, Vulcan exists, the 9th planet. Now, Leverrier definitely was acclaimed for discovering this one, but something was a bit off. For one thing, Neptune had been discovered by professional astronomers working in a legit observatory. I'm sure there was a bit of bias there. But the thing with Neptune is once you know it's where it is, once you know where it's going, you look through astronomical records and realize a lot of people had seen Neptune. Galileo saw Neptune back in the 1610s. Noted that there was some stars that seemed a little bit farther apart, never followed up on it. Same thing with Uranus. Herschel sees this comet or nebulous object, realizes something is a bit odd, and sets in motion a chain of investigations that result in, hey, new planet. But you go back and you look, it had been cataloged as a star repeatedly by different astronomers. With Vulcan, once it was discovered, all kinds of reports of sunspots and transits and all kinds of stuff. It comes in, it's looked at. It doesn't really add up. Either this thing has a revolution of 19.7 days, or it's 38.5 days, and the mass just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into the calculations. How can this tiny little thing be affecting Mercury? And then Leverrier calculates some transits. People turn out, hey, let's look at what, nothing happens. It's not early, it's not late, it's not there. Very quickly, course, being as close to the sun it is, there ought to have been a lot of Vulcan transits to miss. People start thinking something's a bit funny. And not just a case of it not showing up for appointments. You've had guys, this is Heinrich Schwabe, one of the great solar observers of the era. He had been looking for an intramercurial planet from 1826 to 1843, years before Leverrier got on Vulcan care. He found nothing. What he found was a sunspot cycle, which was a great consolation to him because he realized he had done something really good. But no planet. Richard Carrington, 1859, the same year of this Vulcan transit, Carrington sees the X10 solar event. He doesn't see any transiting planets. And then you get the people with the axe to grind. This is Emmanuel Liais, another former assistant at the Paris Observatory. This guy relocated to Brazil. Don't know if he went that far to get away from Leverrier, but you know. He said he'd been observing the sun from the New World at the precise time as Le Corbusier transit, using better equipment, and it didn't happen. I'm in a position to deny positively and absolutely the passage of a planet across the sun. He became one of the most ardent critics of Vulcan and of Leverrier, and he worked in a few nasty digs at Le Corbusier in the process, which were probably not warranted. I mean, this is the only drawing I could find of what Le Corbusier said he saw, which is this teensy little transit just across the limb of the sun. Remember, he wasn't at the eyepiece the whole time. He saw something weird, he was looking at it, went downstairs, he came back out, it didn't move. He thought it looked like a transiting planet. He could have seen a sequence of sunspots. He could have seen a small object from well outside Mercury's orbit, much closer to the Earth, that when he did the calculations based on the size and the motion, he thought it had to be inside the Mercury's orbit. There's no reason to think that he didn't make his observation or report it in good faith, any more than, you know, we should be bashing Cassini's kneecaps for seeing a moon and Venus that wasn't there. But it doesn't make Vulcan any more real. In the meantime, Leverrier was making a lot of enemies. He was a fundamentally conservative man, and that matters a lot when you're dealing with 19th century France with its ups and downs of republics and monarchies. Politically, his conservatism served him very well during the reign of Napoleon III. Scientifically, he was really not willing to entertain anything other than the straight-up Newtonian mechanics that had served him so well through his whole career. No sign that he ever questioned the foundations of it, even as all his attempts to make everything work just fell a little bit short. And his personal traits were causing a lot of problems by this point. He was removed as the director of the Paris Observatory thanks to a staff revolt in 1870. But he got back in when his successor died in a freak accident 2 years later. It was a boating accident, so we can't blame Leverrier, but you know, I'm sure the staff were not really happy about that. Flammarion, who by this point moved on to other things, called him the most appalling character imaginable. Another colleague called him a cute little French term that translates to bedfellow. Young British scientist J.J. Thomson came on a visit to Paris to see the wonderful things there. It was warned, Leverrier is the most detested man around, etc. He wore that whole getup, medals, ribbons, everything, when he was doing his work, and it kind of brings to mind Tycho Brahe reigning over his observatory at Uraniborg in full court dress, which also didn't work out too well for Tycho in the end. He probably needed a PR handler by this point in his career, but he didn't get one. Leverrier died in 1877. By the end of his life, he was again tweaking his calculations of the period and the inclination of Vulcan, and this led to open mockery from the editors of Scientific American. It wasn't even subtle. But once Leverrier was laid to rest, Vulcan continued. in America. So leave Paris and come to Ann Arbor. Canadian-born astronomer James Craig Tubby Watson matriculated at U of M at the age of 15, and shortly thereafter became the director of the Detroit Observatory. This is the year 1863. He was an asteroid hunter, discovered 22 asteroids over the next 15 years, including the first one sighted from China. He was on a trip to China, sighted an asteroid, was able to pick it out from the star field just on memory alone, and was correct. And the imperial family got the honor of naming it. It's called Joywa, Hope of China. And asteroid hunting put him into competition with other astronomers, particularly a guy called Peters that we'll hear a bit from soon. In addition to asteroids, Watson not only accepted the existence of Vulcan, he was determined to find it, pin it down, legitimize it once and for all. There's a story I couldn't verify that he actually sent money to Paris to have a solar system model, including Vulcan, installed in a memorial to Leverrier, which has since been removed. So that didn't do him any good in the end. So Leverrier dies in 1877. 1878, a bunch of guys with telescopes show up in Wyoming. Guy second from the left, very famous guy from Port Huron. We'll mention him in a second. Watson is in this group.
Oh, wow.
So this is the last total solar eclipse across the U.S. in the 19th century. Teams of American astronomers went to all sorts of remote, inhospitable sites along the path of totality. Central City, Colorado, Pikes Peak, Dallas, and Wyoming Territory, which is where Tubby Watson set up shop in the company of Simon Newcomb from the U.S. Naval Observatory, and the guy from Port Huron, aka Thomas Alva Edison. Edison wasn't looking for Vulcan the way that the astronomers were. He actually had a little gizmo that was supposed to measure the heat of the corona, and he went off and had some adventures on his own, but clearly he was hanging out with them at some point because they were all in a photograph together. So, Separation, Wyoming, a dying town recently bypassed by the railroad. Weather's awful. Watson and Newcomb and the other astronomers hang out there for a while. And then, on the morning of the great eclipse, July 29th, it's beautiful. Blue, clear, dust-free. Totality strikes at 3:16 p.m. Newcomb had his strategy all worked out. He dark adapted himself beforehand, and he starts sweeping the sky with his 5-inch refractor looking for a tiny disk of a planet. He sees something a bit odd, and he pauses to measure it with the setting circles. Meanwhile, Watson is working nearby with his 4-inch refractor, which doesn't have setting circles, but that's okay because Watson's got that phenomenal memory. He knows the stars like the back of his hand, and I don't know whether he was trying to compliment Newcomb or not, but he also had the U.S. Naval Observatory reference chart handy. He spots a 4.5 magnitude object, a ruddy disk, little red disk, in between the sun and the Theta star in Cancer. And as the totality is passing and the sky's getting brighter, he thinks he sees a second object. It's new, uncharted. Well, so he runs over to Newcomb and he's like, hey, can you verify this thing for me? And Newcomb's busy looking at his own observations, which he later regretted not double-checking Watson's work, but he didn't have time. Totality was over. So Newcomb couldn't verify that he'd seen any planet. E.J. Holden in Central City, Colorado didn't see it. David Todd in Dallas didn't see it. But Watson was adamant. Word goes out. Vulcan found. I have the honor to report that at the time of totality, I observed a star of 4 and 4.5 magnitude, which I feel convinces an intramercurial planet, no known star in the position observed. Remember, he's going off that amazing memory of his. It had been verified numerous times, but here's the thing. He didn't just claim to find one Vulcan, he claimed he found 2, and everybody else is finding 0. Something's not right. But then, Lewis Swift of Rochester, New York, is observing from Denver. This guy's an amateur. He's a comet hunter who co-discovered Comet Swift-Tuttle, the comet that produces the Perseus through the meteors. And he had discovered other comets and nebulae in his career. He wasn't a crank. At least he wasn't any more of a crank than the rest of these guys. And he was generally a skillful observer. But kind of shades of John Couch Adams back in the day. He's kind of timid. And he's got this data, and he engages in correspondence with people, and the data gets massaged a little bit and a little bit more to try to make everything fit. But you can't make it fit, no matter what you do with the data. Watson claims he sees these two planets. Swift's planet doesn't match to either of them. So you've got, what now, 3 Vulcans, 4 Vulcans? None of this is making sense. And it's all taking place against the backdrop of Cancer and all its faint little stars. So, at this point, Danish-born, cigar-chomping C.H.F. Peters was done with the Vulcan business. This guy, he wasn't just sick of Watson, he had been sick of Vulcan all through Leverrier's lifetime. He'd earlier been requested to try to verify Vulcan during a solar eclipse. He said, it's chasing after wild geese. I'm not doing it. Now, he unleashes a takedown in one of the prominent astronomy journals. He just kicks Swift's observations out entirely. It's like, he's got Watson's fingerprints all over it. I don't care. It's not independent corroboration. Let's just deal with Watson and his stupid planets. And he goes through ad hominem. Astronomers engaged in ad hominem like crazy back then. These guys had the gloves off. So basically, he chalks it up to what we would call averted imagination. Watson saw a star. A star that, in his mind, maybe tinted by the corona of the sun, or dust, or again, desire to see what he wanted to see. He turns it into this little red disk that just isn't there. Also, Vulcan doesn't solve the Mercury mass problem. Also, Richard Carrington and all these other brilliant solar observers have never seen this thing. Why do we believe it now when so many people have not been able to find this thing? And after 20 years of looking for Vulcan, the astronomical community pretty much says, good job, man, good takedown, we're with you 100%. Watson stands his ground. He had seen Vulcan. He would find Vulcan, for real, for all time. At this point, he gets lured to Wisconsin. They're building a new observatory, the Washburn Observatory for U of M Madison. And he goes there, and he's going to build an underground observatory so that he can look at objects close to the sun in daylight. Okay, this is a concept dating back to Aristotle. Like a lot of Aristotle's ideas about science, it is totally wrong. Many people in that era already knew it was totally wrong. You can't just dig a shaft and sit at the bottom of the hole and see stars during the day. It doesn't work. Watson was a little bit stubborn. We don't know how he would have taken the failure of this plan because he suddenly contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 42. The observatory sat unused and unfinished for decades until it was finally demolished as a hazard in the 1940s. Nobody ever used it for anything. He also, there was a Mrs. Watson, and he left all his money to, I believe it's the James Craig Watson Prize, leaving her destitute, which a lot of people weren't too happy about back in the day. But that's it. Vulcan's biggest defender exits the scene even more suddenly than Leverrier. And science marches along. Simon Newcomb turns his attentions to the problem of Mercury's orbit, and he realizes Leverrier done goofed. It's not a 38 arcsecond per century offset, it's 43. The theoretical case for Vulcan is just dead by this point. Newcomb and some of his other colleagues, like a guy named Asa Hall, who discovered the moons of Mars, they're starting to think about tinkering with the foundations of Newtonian gravitational theory. They're open to it. As I said, there's not a single sign that a guy like Leverrier would ever have considered, hey, let's start chipping away at the basics of what we think is the truth. But At this point, Newcomb and Hall and some of their other colleagues, they were willing to entertain reimagining physics. On the observational side, several more eclipse expeditions like this one. This is a chart from 1900 from the Smithsonian. Let's look for Vulcan. Nobody found it. Eventually, research institutions didn't even bother. It was a lost cause. And then, okay, you guys know who this is, right? 1915, general theory of relativity solves the riddle of Mercury's precession once and for all. I really don't like it when Einstein gets set up on this pedestal as some kind of idol of science. And so, well, Einstein, what would Einstein think about this? Einstein's right, Einstein's wrong, Einstein can't be wrong. Of course he can be wrong. He's human. But fact is, the brightest minds of astronomy had struggled with this problem for centuries, and he got the right answer. That this alone would have made him a titan of astronomy, just without anything else that he'd done. This was huge. And I'm not going to inflict general relativity on you. It could be a talk by itself, has been, sure will be in the future. But in a nutshell, Mercury does not orbit in a Newtonian flat space. It is so close to the mass of the sun that it orbits in a curved space. And all of the problems with Mercury's orbit are resolved through that. Newtonian math will never get you to the answer. And, you know, Mike Brown and Neil deGrasse Tyson have nothing on Einstein when it comes to slitting planets, because Einstein didn't just demote Vulcan, he made it go poof, disappear. The explanation of the shift of Mercury's perihelion, which is empirically confirmed beyond a doubt, causes me great joy, but no less than the fact that the general covariance of the law of gravitation has, after all, been carried to a successful conclusion. It's done. History of the centuries, done. Vulcan didn't entirely go away. I mean, there's no evidence it existed. There's no need for it to exist, but that doesn't make crank science stop paying attention. This is from 1968, and it includes a chapter on the planet's astrological influence. So there are still pockets of people out there willing to believe in Vulcan despite there being no evidence whatsoever that such a thing has ever existed. Now, the search does go on for intramercurial bodies. None have been found yet. They may absolutely, truly not exist. Not just planets, but anything. Bob Tremblay actually had some dialogue with Brother Guy Consolmagno, who confirms that the name Vulcan is still reserved for the first intramercurial piece of space vermin to be discovered. So whenever and wherever that's found, and whoever finds it, the name Vulcan is waiting to be claimed. But in the meantime, it's the planet of romance and fiction and the crushed dreams of some very bright and very stubborn guys in the 19th century. Any questions?
Well, if I'm asking, is it possible to have an asteroid of any size in a stable orbit that close to the sun? You won't see it. I mean, it's something that could actually sustain an orbit?
No.
I don't know.
I would bet that the Yarkovsky effect would be significant and they would become unstable very quickly.
Yeah. There may have been, even NASA is still periodically looking, but whether or not anything in there would be stable, how long it would be there, you know, it doesn't seem to make any sense. Yes, Dave?
I think the Yarkovsky effect could be very important during the formation of the object, but I don't think the Yarkovsky effect could be important now because that object would be so big by now that I'm thinking if it's the size of this building, say, already the Yarkovsky effect is negligible. But during the formation, yeah, it's a problem.
Marty?
I was thinking it is possible to see an asteroid transit the sun, but being very close to the Earth at the time, like Tutat or something like that.
And that is, I think personally, that is what Le Corbusier saw. I mean, the man, like I said, he had seen a planetary transit, he had seen sunspots. This isn't just some random country loon, hey look, I saw a planet. And believe me, there were people sending in reports who were in that caliber. He was a dedicated observer. It's just, the sunspot explanation is possible, but that's what makes it so frustrating is there's no single way. It's not like with people who claim they saw transits of Venus when no transits of Venus occurred in their lifetime. You can't say this didn't happen. You can always say, well, this is what they probably saw.
I wonder what the timeline was of how long it took to transit the sun. That would really kind of make a difference.
He thought it was an hour and 17 minutes, but he did not see ingress. He only saw ingress. Yes, Jonathan?
So Thierry Legault in France has repeatedly seen bodies close to the Earth transit the sun. The Hubble Space Telescope, the various space shuttles, and they had pretty good angular size as close as they are to the Earth. So it doesn't seem unreasonable that he could see something passing relatively close to the Earth and have it be larger.
It's not that he saw it, though. It's that with the calculations that he was scratching out, which haven't survived because he actually wrote them down on wood, on a balsa wood thing that he would shave off as he was done, he calculated that it had to be inside Mercury's orbit.
Okay.
So everything is working off the assumption, not just that something is passing from the sun, but that it could only be a tiny object inside of Mercury's orbit.
Yeah, the time puts constraints on it, this hour and 17
Right.
minutes or whatever.
But if it's going more or less in the direction of the sun, then that could stretch it out, even if it's going really fast. If it's going basically down your sight line.
It wouldn't be if it's in orbit.
Is there a question?
Yeah, I'm assuming then that the transit was in the plane of the solar system, or was it some oblique angle?
Actually, I've got the sketch that Le Corbusier made. And
Looked like it was.
yeah,
You had
it's
it drawn, it wasn't.
just this little sort of trip across the limb right there.
Right, but is it orthogonal to the plane of the solar system?
Oh, as far as we know, yeah. Yeah.
So,
That would kind of put it out of the, more in the context of a comet or something, you know,
Right.
that's oblique to the solar system.
Well, that's what Leverrier was actually tinkering with when he died. He was revising his idea that it was at a different inclination than he originally assumed, but again, nothing came of it.
Did he measure the angular size, or was it just a spot, you know?
I don't believe Le Corbusier got to measure the angular size. It was estimated to be so small that they would need 17 of these objects to actually impact Mercury's orbit to the degree that it was impacted. So this would have been a tiny, tiny little body regardless.
what happened to Simon Newcomb's object?
What's that?
What happened to Simon
Oh, it was
Newcomb's
a star. He proved it was a star. He was, because he had setting circles on his telescope, so he was able to pin it down. It's like, oh yeah, I saw a star. Yeah.
Well, let's thank our speakers.
Yes.
What about the pointy ears?
What?
What about the pointy ears?
Pointy ears.
Oh,
Oh, no, come on.
Silly man.
Wrong star.
All right, well, after our Cranbrook meetings, we repair to the Red Coat Tavern on Woodward, just north of 13 Mile. And many of us will be heading there for some gastronomy after the astronomy. And we hope we see you at the banquet on Thursday. And right now is the last chance to buy a discount ticket, so. Otherwise, have a good night and a safe December, and we'll see you in January.
Because usually I did shuttle. Yeah. We get the We used to have people mistaking us for being simple. Because it's an awkward conversation. This was in Ann Arbor. Yeah, right. Yeah. You're going to observatory, not in the that was contemporary, that was 18th century. That was how it was. Hey, good to see you, man.
Yes.
If anybody would like an IDEX poster for 10 or 20 of them, please take them right here.
Really?
I'll give you guys a call.
Oh, sure.
I have some
Take care. My wife's been sick for a while.
I'll be marking down.
What's the matter?
I didn't get no tickets this year because I know she's going to go for it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I want. I'll give you guys a call.
Yeah, okay.
I think you're still rolling, John. Hi. Hi.
How you doing?
Hey, Ben.
Good to see
Thank
you.
for coming.
Yeah, it was great.